I awakened to the shrill howling and yipping of coyotes nearby. I looked at my watch. It was 2:52 a.m. Having grown up in Texas, hearing coyotes wasn't new. Yet this night was even more ominous. They were highly vexed about something, and the noise was eerie. They went on for a few moments, and then silence. Deafening silence. Suddenly, the ground began to shake. I sat up quickly and tried to get my bearings. I knew I was in the open, but I still looked up to ensure that nothing was about to fall on top of me. What is going on? Off in the distance, I could see cars on the interstate start to swerve. This is the Long Journey Podcast with Jason Jamar, detailing my travels across America as I share thrilling stories from my 16-month backpacking trek from California to Maine and my 8-month kayak voyage from Maine to Texas. Day 28. Date, October 17th, 1999. Sunrise 6:43 a.m., sunset 6 p.m. Moon phase, first quarter. Elevation, 879 feet. Location, Quartzsite, Arizona. Fight Club opened that weekend and ran to the top of the box office. But the first rule of Fight Club? Well, you know. I arrived in Blythe, California a couple of days before and rested after several long days of desert hiking. While in Blythe, I purchased a cell phone in the event of an emergency. My very first cell phone ever. It was a Nokia Model 3110, and it stayed off and safely stowed away in my backpack until I needed it. It was stupendous being out of the desert and having all of these amenities around. I found that I craved pizza and steak, and I made sure to get plenty while in the metropolis of Blythe. However, it was time to be underway, so I donned my hat, my pack, and walking stick, and said goodbye to California as I crossed the Colorado River and made my way into Arizona. I stopped halfway across the bridge over the river to take a photo, and while doing so, I leaned my walking stick up against the railing. At about the same time I was snapping photos, vibrations from an 18-wheeler driving over the bridge rattled it enough that my walking stick became dislodged and fell. Great. What a joke. Now I have to go down there and get it. Thankfully, it landed on an island in the center of the channel. I had already walked across Southern California with this stick. If you remember, I found this stick up in the mountains before the trek started, and it made one heck of a bat. So there was no way I was going to leave it. I turned around and hiked down to the river. I had still yet to make it out of California. I waded through the river to the small island to retrieve my walking stick. It was pleasant to take a break in the river, then back on dry ground, and I dried off. I made my way over the bridge, not letting go of my stick this time, and planted my feet firmly on Arizona soil. If you look at either side of the river, the land was the same, but man, oh man, it felt like a real accomplishment to have crossed this imaginary line on a piece of paper that now said Arizona, one state down. It was tough hiking the next 2 days. It took both days to cover the 21 miles to Quartzsite, Arizona. The terrain was very rocky and hills all the way, and it didn't help that I slept in those 2 mornings either. I was on the north side of I-10 and didn't have the luxury of a dirt road like I did in parts of the section between Indio and Blythe. Fun fact, some of those rocks I had to traverse over were lithophonic or had musical qualities. Well, I suppose the qualities lie more in the person who plays them than the rocks themselves. These old volcanic rocks formed with properties that resonate or ring when struck and sound like a bell. So if you had the time, you could make yourself a rock xylophone. You can find many lithophonic stones near Yuma, Arizona as well. Quartzsite was founded in 1879 as an early mining town. Its population is generally around 3,000 people. Except for in the winter months, During January and February, Quartzsite will see over 1 million visitors. It is an RV snowbird mecca, and they host the largest rock and gem show in the world, and folks from all over the world come. I walked into Quartzsite early in the morning and stopped at the first gas station I came to, and loaded up on a few snacks. I left the station, and I noticed I was being followed. I couldn't seem to shake my pursuer. Everywhere I went, there they would be. After half a mile, I plucked up my courage and finally decided to confront my stalker and find out what was the deal. I was met with a wagging tail and a gentle nudge from a wet snout. A beautiful white and gray husky had decided to adopt me. I couldn't persuade him to go back. He didn't have a tag, but he was too well cared for to be a stray. I spent the next hour talking with local businesses around the gas station he had first started following me, trying to figure out where he belonged and if anyone recognized him, so that I could return him home. He would not stop following me. I eventually found someone who knew the dog, and he explained that this happened all the time. That the dog, I can't recollect his name now, pretty much just went where he pleased and befriended everyone, and that they would see that he made it home. After sorting out the dog situation, I sought a campground with a shower and laundry facilities. I found a place on the far end of town called the Lazy Days RV Park. Karen Hutchins, the park manager, greeted me and helped me find a perfect place to camp. She set me up next to a cactus garden, where I had access to electricity to power my laptop and brand new cell phone. Later in the day, she showed me some of the residents of this particular cactus garden. Their park had become a refuge for Sonoran desert tortoises, and the state had made it a desert tortoise preserve. These tortoises are vegetarians and they love frozen vegetables as a treat. In the wild, they burrow into the ground and hibernate through the winter. You must never pick one up in its natural habitat. When you do, they release all the contents of their bladders, which may be a month's worth of water for these animals. Baby tortoises hatch around September and October each year, and I was just in time to see the babies. They are cute little critters. Afterward, I met the camp owners, Karen's parents, Paul and Jean Heron. Paul and I hit it right off, and he invited me to accompany him the following morning for a jeep ride through the desert to explore old abandoned gold mines. I eagerly accepted and then turned in for an early bedtime. Later that night, I awakened to the shrill howling and yipping of coyotes nearby. I looked at my watch. It was 2:52 a.m. Having grown up in Texas, hearing coyotes wasn't new. Yet this night was even more ominous. They were highly vexed about something, and the noise was eerie. They went on for a few moments, and then silence. Deafening silence. Suddenly, the ground began to shake. I sat up quickly and tried to get my bearings. I knew I was in the open, but I still looked up to ensure that nothing was about to fall on top of me. What is going on? Off in the distance, I could see cars on the interstate start to swerve. I've been in California for 4 years and have never experienced an earthquake. Oh, sure, we had them, but they were minor, and I never remember feeling them and knowing beyond a shadow of a doubt this was an earthquake. I always heard about it the next day on the news. And they would think back, oh, I do remember a faint kind of unsteady feeling. Well, here I am in Arizona, and I get my first real earthquake. Like being in a tornado, my first thought was, whoa, this is pretty cool, not considering the full gravity of the situation. It felt like I was lying on the edge of a king-size waterbed, and someone plopped down on the other side. It came in 2 or 3 little shakes in about 30 seconds or less. The whole ground gently rocked back and forth like I was in a cradle. Afterward, I could hear the water sloshing back and forth in a small fish pond inside the cactus garden next to me. I never did hear the coyotes again that night. Since it was minor here, I figured perhaps I was on the edge of a much bigger one. You never really hear of earthquakes in Arizona. I discovered the following day that the epicenter was a 7.1 magnitude quake in a place called Hector Mine, as the buzzard flies about halfway between Barstow and 29 Palms, California, 150 miles west of my current location. Thankfully, it was an unpopulated area and no significant damages or injuries occurred. Later that morning, Paul, who was 71 years young at the time and got around better than most folks my age, took me on a trip I will never forget. Paul had been living there since the late 1970s. He had semi-retired when he moved to Quartzsite and devoted most of his time to exploring the desert country around him. His preferred mode of travel switched between Jeep and mountain bike. He had logged in thousands of hours out here and knows this desert like the back of his hand. They say that no one around Quartzsite knows it better than he. We loaded up in the Jeep, first stopping off in town to grab crackers and Vienna sausages. Surprisingly, this made a terrific lunch later on. We then headed about 10 miles east to venture into the wilderness. I tell you, there is more to the desert than anyone can imagine. I came to admire the desert for its harsh beauty. All the life in it is superbly adapted for this land of extremes. We arrived at Apache Wash. Located in Apache Wash is the Apache Chief Gold Mine. It started sometime in the early 1920s and then really got into the swing of things in the 40s. The entrance, camouflaged with the rest of the desert landscape around it, didn't look like much. Once inside, however, I was amazed at the labyrinth of tunnels that ran through these hills. There are 3 subterranean levels, but we needed rappelling gear to reach the lower 2. This is due to the fact of people throwing boulders down the shafts and destroying the ladders. We encountered many bats, but I'm not sure what variety they were. These bats were larger than the Mexican free-tail bats that we have in abundance back home. Also, we found bighorn sheep droppings just inside the entrance. They will take refuge there in the very hottest part of the summer. Then we were on our way to Dripping Springs. As we walked, Paul pointed out a great multitude of ancient petroglyphs believed to have been left by the Anasazi, the ancestors of the Hopi and Pueblo Native Americans. On our way back, we lost all of the transmission fluid in the Jeep and came to a complete halt. We were several miles down a wash when this happened. Paul called his son Larry, who came and towed us out. Despite this hiccup in our transportation, at the end of the day, it was one of the most exciting days of the journey thus far. We had so much fun that Paul invited me to go again the next day, so I extended my stay in Quartzsite another day. And I went out to the grocery store that evening to get crackers and Vienna sausages for our lunch. The next day, another adventure. Thankfully, no breakdowns this time. Paul took me to where the desert wildlife flock several different watering holes and springs. I still didn't see any bighorn sheep, though once again I found plenty of their sign. And we saw more evidence of ancient civilizations. Paul showed me places in the rock where the Anasazi would grind their grain and fragments of old earthen pottery left behind on the desert floor. He led me to several rock overhangs with manos and metates in the stone. Mano means hand, and the people would take another stone in the palm of their hand and grind it to and fro until it left an indention or a hole in the rock. I had had a blast. I got to go gallivanting through the desert canyons, spelunk through old gold mines, and study ancient signs from civilizations past. And go four-wheeling through the desert. Not bad at all. I was incredibly thankful to my host and guide, Paul Heron. Then I was on my way again, and not far out of Quartzsite, I headed north on Highway 60. As I noticed the signs around me, they didn't look good. They actually seemed downright depressing and full of despair. "You're now beyond hope," reads the sign that you see as you leave Hope, Arizona. And if you are venturing out into this territory without the proper provisions, then you might as well be as the sign says. I camped in an RV park there in Hope. I was able to get a shower and do my laundry. You know, the important things. All that there is in Hope is the RV park and a gas station. From there, I made a full day travel up to Wyndon, Arizona. I made it there just after dark, just in time for a Bible study at a local church. So I went inside and enjoyed it. I met many friendly folks, including Mr. and Mrs. Steele. They run the Desert Wells Christian Center, and they offered me a place to stay at their camp for the night. I gladly accepted, and I enjoyed getting to know them and their friend Marie Green, an accomplished poet. 34 more miles of desert, I came to one of my water caches and decided to make camp. Something had gotten into 2 of my 4 one-gallon water jugs, leaving me with only 2.5 gallons, but still more than enough. Since I had an abundant water supply, I made some tomato ramen soup. Javelinas visited me in the night. I was startled awake around midnight to snorting and rummaging around my tent. I invited them to leave, and they took me up on my offer. The next day, I gave another run at the rice-a-roni. It was herb and butter flavored. I took the chicken breast out of that day's MRE, and MRE is a remarkably well-preserved military ration, short for meal ready to eat. Chopped it up and mixed it in. This made for a delicious meal, though I recommend any chicken breast other than one out of an MRE. It was less than 20 miles from there until I would start up into the mountains again. On my way, I met some Seventh-day Adventists who were having a retreat. I didn't know much about their denomination, so I was glad at the invitation to stay with them and learn more. I had a wonderful time visiting and doing work projects. During the day, while we were not involved in study, I spent time helping my new friend David from Idaho with odd jobs. There were doorknobs and light fixtures to replace. Also, there was an old leather chair with a sprung spring that needed repairing. Who knew all those little tacks could be so time-consuming? This one job assured me that I don't believe I will ever go into the upholstery business. My camp host for the week had a different diet than I was accustomed to. They were vegetarians and only had 2 meals a day. But man, could they make vegetarian dishes that blew you away. I was genuinely surprised at how good everything was. All kinds of great casseroles that were very hearty and full of taste. It was a nice break from my daily hiking regimen. I had a lovely visit and enjoyed the fellowship, and then was ready to hit the road again after the rest. Plus, I never wanted a big old greasy cheeseburger more than right then. Day 37. Date, October 26, 1999. Sunrise, 6:45 a.m. Sunset, 5:43 p.m. Moon phase, waning gibbous. Elevation, 5,367 feet. Location, Prescott, Arizona. Once in Prescott, the police station was my first stop. Officer Ron Jacobelli and the other fine men and women in blue were holding my cache of food and supplies, namely my winter long johns. I had left a supply cache with them 2 months before in preparation for the trip. I had been anxiously awaiting for my long underwear. Now that I was at higher elevations, the nights were starting to get a tad bit chilly. Soon I would need my winter sleeping bag too. After fetching my supplies from Officer Jacobelli, I met up with Carl and Trudy Gammertsfelder. They were awaiting my arrival here. My friend Karen in Quartzsite called them and thought that they might want to meet me. They did, and I had a perfect stay in Prescott. Who can argue with home cooking and a warm bed? And Carl, his nickname Gammy, gave me a tour of the town. Prescott started as a mining town. As I understand it, the gold rush of 1849 made its way here after the gold started petering out in California. About the time this place started to die down as a major gold town, the big rush to Alaska was on. Prescott was the territorial capital twice. First in 1864, then in 1867 it moved to Tucson for about 7 years. After such time, it moved back to Prescott for 11 more years, before settling in Phoenix, Arizona. The next day I went hiking with Gammy at the Granite Dells, a beautiful outcropping of giant granite formations and boulders near Watson Lake. Then I went on a service call with Gammy. He had a computer repair and support business. That night, I watched the final game in the World Series with Gammy. We had watched Game 3 the night before. The Yankees swept the series, winning every game against the Atlanta Braves. I don't catch every World Series, but every year when it happens, I'm always reminded of my time with Trudy and Carl Gametsfelder in Prescott, Arizona, and the hospitality that was shown to me. About 5 miles outside of Prescott, I met a fellow long-distance traveler on State Route 169 on his bicycle. John, a physicist from Holland, had left his job to travel North America. He began his trek in Vancouver 2 months prior and was on his way to San Diego, then on to Mexico, and maybe eventually ending up in Guatemala. John mentioned, "I love it here, and there is nothing like this in Europe. Everything is just so big over here in the United States." About that time, I couldn't help but to agree with him, as I noticed the forest green hue of the mountains to the northeast, contrasted by the Golden Valley prairies below. We stood there on the side of the road and probably visited for about half an hour, sharing stories. It was pleasant to visit with someone doing something similar to myself. We were a small club, but it's okay to talk about our club. I couldn't help but to think of another member of this small club, Josh Barber, from my hometown. He was in the middle of a cross-country bicycle ride also, from Eugene, Oregon to the East Coast. There had been a write-up in the local paper back in Marble Falls when I was home just before starting my trip. I talked to his dad, Don Barber, and got his contact info so that we could keep in touch and encourage one another on our respective treks. He had about a 2-week head start on me, and needless to say, he finished his trek much faster than I did. Next time on the Long Journey podcast, I had let my fire die out, crawled into my tent, and tucked myself away into my winter sleeping bag. I was thrilled to have it in my gear now because it was in the upper 30s. After a hard day's worth of travel, I was in a deep slumber. Unbeknownst to me, a bull elk had found himself in my camp. At this moment, my would-be assailant bugled like a banshee. At this range, an elk call, especially from a bull, is very loud. As I mentioned before, I was sleeping deeply. His call to the wild liked to have made me jump out of my skin. After the fog of war set in, I wanted to take cover and find the enemy's position. Once I came to my senses, I called out to my adversary in a half-yell, half-grunt, "Hyah!" This had the desired effect of startling him to move on, though instead of going away, the sound of his hooves crashing to the ground as he ran was coming towards me. I fumbled with my sleeping bag zipper, trying to get out of my bag in a hurry. Just when I thought he was going to crash through my tent, he turned and jumped over a downed tree and went off in another direction. This was a relief, for I was already having flashbacks to when I was run over by a Marine 5-ton and didn't think an elk would feel much better. You can find more details about the Long Journey podcast at journeylong.com. And be sure to subscribe, rate, and review the podcast on your platform of choice. Thank you, and may you journey long.